Recording. Let's present. MUD 201N, Introduction to Urban Planning and Design, with a little bit of GIS. As we all know, the world is experiencing not really globalization, higher rates of urbanization. Over here on the screen, you can see in 1950s, majority urban countries included Australia, the United States, most of English-speaking Europe, South Africa, and like also Japan. But by 2020, it has been seen that almost, it looks like on the map, about 80% of the world is now majority urban, excluding countries like the Philippines, India, East Africa, and like just a small blip here of I don't know what place this is in uh, the north of Latin America. And then by 2047, it is expected that the Philippines will also join the majority urban countries. So what is causing this? It's really population growth and the fact that city centers are magnets for people, mostly because there's more opportunity, um, more business, more income, better housing, etc., etc. So cities attract people. This is not a sort of controversial statement. It's happening all over the world. So we need to prepare for it. So how do we prepare for it? GIS and QGIS. We need to plan our cities. We need to basically take down what's currently here, take stock of our utilities, infrastructure, built environment, so we can better plan for the incoming or like the current growing population, not just in the world but also the Philippines and our like local provinces, I would say, and local communities. So QGIS, as we discussed last week or like in a few weeks ago, is a user-friendly open source geographic information system licensed under the GNU General Public License. Basically, this means it's a free software for creating maps. And what kinds of maps are we trying to do in this class? We're trying to analyze. We don't have like street data yet, but we can use it. We have OpenStreetMap. Building data, we could probably use this like with the shape files we created, and vegetation data if we had those, and integrated data. So basically, currently we're just going to focus on population because that's what we have. So we don't have to like start off from scratch. And then in a more general sense, GIS is a database containing descriptions of phenomena for which location is relevant. On the screen, you can see what the Earth would look like without the oceans, without the body of water. So we get this image that this popular image of the Earth that it's like perfectly circular or like a sphere, but in actually it's more of a geoid shape. So you see the different bumps here, and it looks like a potato basically. And then the current sort of systems to measure locations on the Earth are not perfect because the Earth is not perfectly circle, it's irregular, therefore we can't use a regular sort of measuring system because it won't align with the Earth. So over here you see a XY axis being superimposed over a ellipse, and then also the actual shape of the Earth. So it doesn't fit completely within the ellipse, and our what do you call this? Our popular sort of projection systems don't accurately measure the actual physical location of points on the Earth. So currently, there are two types of coordinate systems, basically how we label things or identify things on the surface of the Earth. There is the GCS, or the Geographic Coordinate System. It defines the location of an object on a spherical/spheroidal model of the Earth. So as we discussed, it's not a perfect model, but it still works. It's still fairly accurate. And the more sort of accurate version of that is the projected coordinate system, which represents the location of an object on a flat model of the Earth. So basically, you take the globe and then you flatten it out. There are several ways of doing this. You can turn it into a cone, you can turn it into a cylinder, but because it's flattened out, there is what you call deformations, or what the changes in the perspective, because you're making a 3D object flat, so it will deform that 3D object. So over here on the right side, you see a human head projected onto the different types like of flat drawings. So you can see here on the lower right what the human head looks like when you flatten it with accurate dimensions. So that's what you see here. So what our maps are actually presenting is not the what they call the 100% recreation of the Earth, but a projection or representation of it. And over here, we have more types of map projections. There's over 20 of them, I think even more currently. And you have the ATOF model, the Fuller model, etc., etc. This one is also even a star. But anyway, that's what GIS does. So we're taking the three-dimensional surface of the Earth and projecting it into a flat surface so we can plan, coordinate, and like manage our like land and resources. And then, as some of you may know, because for those urban planning majors, urban planning is really just the managing of resources in a city or urban area. For me personally, I would divide these resources into physical, economic, and social factors. The output for urban planning majors or urban planning professionals would be regional policy making, zoning maps, and large-scale developments. So like residential complexes like Mandani Bay, or like larger mixed-use complexes like the Bonifacio City or something. I forgot what it's called in Manila. The Bonifacio something. And then urban design is the implementation of those planning decisions. Basically, the next step in urban planning, primarily focusing on the space between buildings. So we're talking about public space, streets, sidewalks, plazas, waterfronts. And the output of urban design professionals are city level policymaking, basically a step below, although not easier, but still complex enough that it needs policymaking, because at all the levels of the built environment, from national, regional, provincial, metropolitan, city, and barangay, there's so much data that needs to be quantified and defined so that we can better manage our land. Other outputs for urban design include the development of public space, like public plans, and the development of residential subdivisions. So those like villages that you see all over Cebu, and like probably your local community as well. And the scope of urban planning and design is basically everything in that land has to be quantified, analyzed, and managed. There's, for me, 4 steps in urban planning and design. The only difference is the scale. In urban planning, you're usually doing it on like a regional, provincial scale, and in urban design, you're doing it by city and street level. And then, as mentioned before, you have physical, economic, and social factors. And the 4 steps are defining the site, and the stakeholders, evaluating the site, basically identifying your problem, then placing your vision or creating your solution, and then implementing that solution, whether it be short-term experiments or medium-term experiments. Like usually, the smaller the project, you can do short-term. The bigger the project, you lean more towards long-term experiments. And then, of course, the 5th step, which is often like forgotten, is the ongoing evaluation and like long-term improvement. So once the proposal is done, it's approved, it's built, you need to constantly maintain it, because as you know, urban planning, the city is constantly changing, and we need people to monitor that change so that our plans are updated and the quality of life is maintained or improved. And then just a quick side note here on the definition of urban and rural areas. There's a popular belief, especially between architects, that you need to develop everything for everything to be utilized. While in urban planning and urban design, we say that the rural areas, the open spaces, the undeveloped areas are just as important as the urban areas, because that's where you put your agriculture, your farming, basically all of the other services and activities that help support the urban areas. Because if everything is built up, where do you get your food? There are like vertical farms, but undeveloped land, basically farming land, is really still the best way to produce food and other resources. Like where do you get your water? You get it from the river, clean river water. You need to maintain that. If you develop on top of that, what you get is sewage waste, unless you have some kind of crazy water purifying scheme. Anyway, in the Philippines, what is classified as urban is that if an area, a barangay, has a population of 5,000 or more. Also, other definitions include if a barangay has at least one establishment with a minimum of 100 employees. And finally, if a barangay has 5 or more establishments with a minimum of 10 employees and 5 or more facilities within a 2 kilometer radius from a barangay hall. So, one thing that's always constant here in the Philippines, the US, and Australia are the number of people, the population, and specifically for the Philippines, we're also looking at economic activity, like if there's a business establishment within a 2 kilometer radius from a barangay hall. Also, I noticed that my numbering here is like messed up. But anyway, moving on. So a quick overview of the history of cities. Cities have been around since like 35,000 BCE. One of the earliest cities were the cities of Mesopotamia, the Egyptian cities that came after that, the Greek cities, and then the Roman cities. And then during the medieval period, we had the Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, and the Renaissance cities. So, and with just one thing I want to highlight between this period from 35,000 BCE to 1600 CE, one common planning method or like a city plan method was the grid. So basically, why was the grid used? So they could subdivide land evenly, and then it made the owners of that land feel like they had the same rights as their neighbor, etc., etc. So it was easier to subdivide, easier to sell, easier to manage. That's why they went with the grid. So the same sort of development happened in Asian countries, but for unfortunately we don't have much documentation of that because we're trained in English and we get the English books. The Asian books like from China, India, Japan still need to be translated and are not as popular, unfortunately. So that's something that's a big gap in my knowledge. I'm not very familiar with the development of cities historically in the Asian countries, but the patterns of development are more or less the same, such that during the Industrial Revolution, both the European and Asian countries experienced increased population thanks to the steam engine and the invention of electricity. And this again further increased or like added more reasons for people to flock to cities because there's more factories, more work, more pay, and they have like access to electricity. And then when you get a lot of people coming together, one of the bigger problems of that is that you need your waste management systems in place. You need to keep your cities clean. And one of the sort of biggest failures of 1800s or the Industrial Revolution is that the increased pollution, which we are also feeling today in climate change. So increased CO2 emissions, etc., etc. And then finally, we have like several big wars. The um, the World War One in like where is this 1914 to 1918, and World War Two from 1939 to 1945. I also included the Phil-Am War here from 1899 to 1902. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that these conflicts have basically a large impact on cities, such that because we have these wars, a lot of our cities get damaged, and then while everything gets sort of destroyed, there's also opportunity for reconstruction or rebuilding. And then finally, after World War II, we have the rebuilding of the cities by the modernist architects or the more modernist designers. Technically, the urban planner and urban designer weren't really called as such until the 1960s. Most of the people who were designing cities were either engineers, architects, and somewhere along those lines of professions. And one of the biggest sort of learnings from that is that engineers and architects were very much stuck in their own world, and the plans they developed weren't very kanang people friendly. So they were focusing on their own grand visions, focusing on their own people, and not really thinking about the masses. So writers like Lewis Mumford over here, who was not an architect, not an engineer, but was a historian and sociologist, advocated for the organic city, where culture is not usurped by technological innovation, but rather thrives with it. So this method demands personal experience and observation. So thinking about how the city is perceived from the citizen's point of view, and not just the elite, those who are college graduates, professionals, designers, etc. So he's thinking about the lay people. And this was further developed by Kevin Lynch in his book, The Image of a City, published in 1960, thinking about what does the city mean for its citizens. And he identified five sort of elements of a city: the path, the node, the landmark, the edge, and the district, basically dividing elements of a city that would be meaningful or significant for the citizens. And these paths, nodes, landmarks, edges, and districts ended up helping sort of the citizens identify different parts of the city and help them navigate the city. So his argument was, if a city is has a proper image, it becomes more friendly, or like more usable to the citizens and more meaningful to them, because they have path, nodes, landmarks, edges, and districts. He also like introduced the concept of mental mapping. Basically, you can go where you need to go without signages, because you know how the city works. You have idea of where the paths and landmarks are, and you can like find your way. And then finally, one of the more famous sort of developments in urban planning and urban design is the book The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. She argued that modernist urban planning oversimplified life in diverse communities. Again, because engineers and architects focus on the big picture, they forget that there are people living in these streets when they propose large highways and basically the privatization of public space, focusing on like private cars, semi-private malls, and the community gets left behind. So Jane Jacobs opposed large-scale urban renewal programs and like wanted more incremental development. This was also one of the sort of ideas way back like 1960s, or not 1960s, like 1800s, like before the Industrial Revolution. A couple of Renaissance architects also had the same idea, and Jane Jacobs got those ideas from them. And then over here we have some sample urban planning projects. I'll just breeze through them quickly so you don't have to, because this is an urban design class. So an example of urban planning project would be a site over here. This is a residential site, about 6,600 hectares. And the main sort of area where we're going to develop is over here, an area called Annan Grove, which is about 350 hectares. So to develop this 350 hectare lot, we're looking at another 6,600 hectares to see how everything fits. So this falls under what we call systems thinking, and making sure our new developments fit into the existing system. So we have some numbers here. In the north of the project site, we have 4,000 dwellings. This is the development called the Gables. To the west, we have 9,600 dwellings from a project called Box Hill and Box Hill Industrial. And to the south, we have North Kellyville with 4,500 dwellings. So again, we're looking at the number of housing stock and the population. And whenever we propose, ideally, whenever a new residential project is proposed, it should fit the demand of the area. So this area already has like existing demand, but our project brief suggested that there's even more demand here in this area. So our project should be what they call this, useful or valuable for this area, because they need more residential projects. Some factors included in urban planning, you're looking at zoning maps, development controls, like the building heights, heritage conservation, and specific to Australia, bushfire prone areas in red. So in these red markings here on the map highlighted that areas that are prone to basically spontaneously combusting during the extreme dry season of Australia, and this is like what they call bushfire areas. So you don't want to develop here. One way of mitigating the effect of bushfires is just removing the vegetation completely, so there's nothing to burn. So that's how that was our proposal for this project. And then other constraints include the water lines, the existing lakes, the slope, and then the public utilities, electricity, water, telecommunications. And once everything is sort of like analyzed and managed, then we can create our master plan. So this was done using AutoCAD and good old-fashioned research and documentation. But if we had QGIS for this project, it would have been a lot more smoother, because we could input all of the maps, translate them to QGIS, and then update them as we go along. So the strength of GIS and QGIS is you have a database for several different factors like building height, zoning, etc., etc., and then it should be readily available to whoever wants to develop on that land. Currently in the Philippines, as far as I know, I think Manila already has some GIS maps and some parts of Cebu maybe, but for the most part, we don't have this. So just imagine a future where local government has GIS. Developments could be a lot faster and more efficient and more sustainable because they're looking at not just the economic factors like how much money they're going to make, but they're looking at geographical factors like the slope, water lines, social factors like heritage sites. So everything should fit together within the existing system. And I'll just skip over his. This is a Sydney Planning and Urban Design project called the CBD and Southeast Light Rail. So the original, or basically the first impetus or the first idea would be an urban planning study highlighting where would be the best location for a new light rail development. A light rail is basically a train line, but the rails are lighter, as the name suggests. They're smaller and they're like embedded into the road. So identifying where the train should go, what the stops are, that's an urban planning endeavor. This would include studies on population, where are the most people that could be serviced, how much it would cost to develop the land. Usually an area with higher population has a higher land value, so that like goes into the calculation of where the route should be. And then, as we stated earlier, urban design is the implementation of those plans, those policies. So some statistics for this George Street concept design. This is basically one section of the light rail project. It is trying to solve the problem of traffic and congestion in the CBD because this line, this street, George Street, is usually congested, especially during peak hours. So the government, the local Sydney government, decided that they would close down this road and add a light rail to reduce traffic congestion. So more people can be moved in like one car of a light rail line compared to basically 20 private vehicles. So their solution was on December 13, 2012, the New South Wales government, that's NSW, decided to build a light rail from the Circular Quay, that's near the, what they call this, up here, near the Sydney Opera House, to Central Station down here, and then to Kensington and Randwick, which was opened in 14 December 2019. So just as a year before, like not really a year before, but just before the pandemic started. So this is the line over here. To the north, we have Circular Quay. That's where the Sydney Opera House is. Town Hall, basically their equivalent of the Barangay Hall for the City of Sydney. And then Central Station, as its name suggests, the central station of the City of Sydney. The project cost was about 2.2 billion Australian dollars, which is the equivalent of 78.8 billion Philippine pesos. Track length for this section is about 12 kilometers, which runs through George Street, which is like the total track length is 12 kilometers and the George Street section is only 2.6 kilometers. And then over here, you can very easily imagine that this map could have been done with AutoCAD or GIS. The advantage of GIS is that it's lighter and more easily shared and more easily editable. So when you make edits, everyone should be able to see it, like you share the same file and everyone's updated. Whereas in AutoCAD, you would need to have the AutoCAD program, which is a lot heavier than QGIS, and like the changes aren't automatic or like shared automatically to everyone once you make it. And then over here is just a street section showing a street tree and the different utilities underneath the tree that provides not water drainage, telecoms, and what do you call this? Yeah, drainage and telecoms. Also maybe electrical lines, I'm not sure. So it has, number 1 is paving on the slab, number 2 is existing compacted soil, number 3 is the telecom lines, number 4 is existing mains, water mains slash gas with root protection that's down here. And then number 5 is 3.5 wide and 0.65 meters structural cell trench. So this is number 5. So this is this whole thing here. where you put the roots of the trees and the utilities. And then drainage to trench is number 6 over here. And then 7 is drain to trench below. Basically, the grate that's on street level. And then number 8 is the existing stormwater drain. You can't really see it. There's a pipe here underneath this whole sort of a section for the roots of the trees. So there's like a brown pipe here. You can like ask for the higher quality image. And then another thing they also included, when selecting the tree, they also studied the color of the tree during summer and autumn. So it changes like from red to green. And then another detail, this is more urban design, um, basically identifying what are the finishes or the type of street tiles which will go onto the um, light rail track. I don't think these were implemented because as far as I know, it just looks like plain asphalt as it's currently implemented. You can actually see the light rail line in Google Maps. So before we have we have the before image over here with the street lamps and the basically 4-lane road, and now the after with the light rail line and like 1 lane of road on each side and larger pedestrian sidewalks, and then some street cafes like benches and like on street like commercial activities like food and whatever. So this would activate the space, the public space, giving or returning more, what do you call this, road to pedestrians. So removing the cars, adding more people, adding more trees, adding more activities, and then the city will become more livelier. So it's not a city for cars, but it's a city for people. And then finally, some developments in Cebu. I'm sure you've heard of it or are part of these organizations. Cebu leads the MCDCB, the Metro Cebu Development Coordinating Board, Pasig Transport, are really working to make not just Cebu but also Manila more livable cities. So we're trying to move away from vehicle-dominated cities and instead trying to bring back the roads and streets to the people. And then some webinars I attended over here. Some parallels of the Netherlands, probably the cycling capital of the world. In the 1970s, that's when the Netherlands really put into place their cycling infrastructure. And the one sort of parallel here, the few parallels here include not enough space for the number of cars, meaning they had traffic congestion. They had the oil crisis, which is kind of like what we're experiencing now with the increase of gas prices due to the Ukraine-Russian war, and the need for alternatives. So as gas prices increase and increase, people will be less inclined to use their private cars and look for alternative modes of transportation. The question is, are our cities and local communities willing to look for new alternatives? And then, of course, because this is a presentation from the Netherlands, they suggest cycling as an alternative. And then this slide here was from the same webinar talking about how urban mobility, basically how you move in a city, is all about space. And the leftmost image shows people standing on a piece of road, on a section of road. And then the next image is a bus and how many people you can fit inside the bus. And then the third image is a row of bicycles and how many people can fit on those bicycles. And finally, the last, these are the same number of people. If they rode cars, they would take up almost all of the road. So if I remember correctly, these are the same number of people. So you can have like a comparison. Same number of people, different modes of transportation, but a very dramatic change in the use of space. So if the same number of people use cars, then the road is full. If the same number of people use a bus or a bicycle, then we only use like 50% or less, and maybe even like 1/3 of the road only. And then down here is a table showing that as you increase density, the usefulness or the efficiency of the car goes down, because again, because it's such a small space, you have limited road space, and then so many cars are very inefficient. They like fit maybe 4 or 5 people at one time. We should really be designing away from private vehicles. And then here are some other images basically saying the same thing. And then why some sort of long-term projections if we move away from private vehicles, we're reducing our carbon CO2 emissions. We're preventing or like mitigating the effects of climate change. And one of the bigger things is the biodiversity collapse due to the pollution and like all of the negative impacts from the industrial revolution that have been done since the 1800s. So basically, we need to bike more, walk more, and drive less. So in summary, what is urban planning and urban design? It's an ongoing process. It's collaborative. It's for people. And GIS and QGIS mirror this because it's also an ongoing process. It's collaborative. We work together with different organizations, both locally and internationally. And finally, QGIS and the urban planning and design careers really focus for the people, while other careers like doctors, architects, engineers focus on their clients. So it's more sort of yeah, more of like thinking the big picture, thinking about the big picture and helping more people and not just our individual clients. And finally, we can talk about our seat work number 5. So again, as we mentioned earlier, population is really one of the biggest factors for determining or like measuring how well a city is doing. In general, increasing population means increasing urban development, more economic activities, and more economic opportunities for everyone in that area. So these questions, is my area growing or declining? You can tell that right away from the population data from philatlas.com. What are the different activities occurring in your area? So based on your experience, what are the different sort of opportunities in your area? For Cebu, we have the BPOs, we have the IT park, we have a lot of commercial activities from our malls, and then most of our income or like our attractiveness comes from opportunities provided by those services, like the BPOs, the commercial areas, and the offices. And because more people are coming in here, coming into Cebu, we need more office buildings, more residential areas. So there's also opportunities for architects and engineers. So the final question is, if your area is growing, how would you sustain it? So how do you sustain the businesses? How do you sustain the growth? And as we mentioned before, it's all about making it more walkable, increasing density, reducing pollution, and providing better access to electricity, water, and communication. So hopefully that will help you answer these 3 questions. Very simple, not really a big problem at all. And of course, there are no right or wrong answers. I'd like to know how you interpret the population growth or decline of your area. And you use QGIS to show your map over here. And then in the next few activities, we'll show other ways to sort of represent population growth in QGIS. So that's all from me. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you next time.